I want to welcome everybody to Christ Church Cathedral. I know some of you have been here for a couple hours. This is the latest in our Spotlight Sunday forums. This is something that we've started new this year. They're periodic community forums on Sunday afternoons where we bring people in really from all over the place to have community conversations about issues that are important to the conversation, to the community. We had Jeff Hood, Pastor Jeff Hood down from Texas here in September, and he talked about the intersectionality of all the different movements of liberation that are going on right now. A couple weeks ago we had Jeff Kozatek. Jeff is the wonderful juggler and entertainer, but also produced a great trilogy of short films called Mask, which really gets us to look at how can we be our true and authentic selves in community. We had Betsy Douglas, who is a local marriage and family therapist, here to talk about, before Thanksgiving, how do you navigate the waters of family gatherings. So we've done all sorts of different things. And this afternoon, we're really honored to have Naomi Tutu with us here. Any of us who have been here in St. Louis, and really in America, for any amount of time, knows that our human life here together is about race and it is about class. And that apartheid is not just something that happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It is something that happens all around us, and we're a part of it. This has become especially evident to us in the last year and a half since Michael Brown was killed and his body lay in the street for 4.5 hours outside the Canfield Apartments. And one of the things that I found almost immediately was a rush to people talking about truth and reconciliation. And I know that felt very appealing to me. And part of what I am beginning to learn about that is that impulse that I was trying to get to, that itch I was trying to scratch, is actually very counter to what truth and reconciliation has been about and continues to be about. It's not about reestablishing comfort. And in fact, it's exactly the opposite. It is about diving deep into discomfort. And so what we want to talk about today, and we want to give Naomi a chance to talk about us with, is her experience of truth and reconciliation, and maybe to dream with us a little bit about what that really, really means and what that really might mean for us. So we fashioned this title of Truth and Reconciliation, South Africa and St. Louis. And so again, I want to thank Andrew Suter. It's because of Andrew's friendship with Naomi that we were able to make this connection. So Andrew, thank you for bringing her to us. Debbie and Dan Link, especially thank you for the hospitality that you are providing. Thank you to everyone who set up the coffee hour. And now at this point, I'm just going to sit down and be quiet because you didn't come here to hear me. And say, Naomi, it is wonderful to again have you here. And can you please greet Naomi too?
Good afternoon. Just a show of hands, how many were actually able to see the film or part of the film, Long Night's Journey into Day? Okay, so a minority. Okay, well, it lets me know where I can start. So, first of all, I want to make it clear, because Reverend Mike said this morning that I actually worked with the Truth Commission. I like to claim that I did, but I didn't, really. And my claim comes out of the fact that once my dad was appointed the chairperson of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he organized pre-commission meetings with different groups, particularly political groups, and in particular those who had some concern about what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission would look like. And because he's an African man, meetings are not things that you hold at a table around which people just sit and talk. Meetings have to include food. And because my mother had been married to him a long time and knew he was an African man, and therefore made quick her escape to Johannesburg for 3 months while these pre-meetings were going on. I ended up being the person who was in charge of catering. And so I supplied these meetings with meals and desserts. And so I like to tell people, if it had not been for my lamb curry, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission would have failed. There you have it. But so I'm going to start us really from the basic history of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so that we at least are coming at it from a shared perspective, a shared idea of the history. So the TRC was South Africa's response to the end of apartheid. So it was a response to the end of conflict and oppression. And in the negotiation as to what are we going to do as a country to deal with the horrors of our history, there were actually two positions. There was the one position that said the only way we can move forward is to basically wipe the slate clean for everybody. So we don't ask questions, we just give a general amnesty for anything that happened during apartheid, and we move forward as a country with saying, you know, what you did under apartheid doesn't really matter. We are a new South Africa. And the other side, the other perspective was that there is no way, given the horrors that were apartheid, that we can simply say to people, forgive and forget. Let's just pretend it didn't happen and move forward. That in fact, the horrors of apartheid were such that it required Nuremberg-style trials, and that we needed to put people on trial for crimes against humanity. And clearly, neither of those things happened, and what we had was a TRC, which was actually a compromised position. So the act that brought into place the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had designed it as a commission that would hear the stories of victims and survivors of human rights abuses, that would secondly hear amnesty applications from those who were perpetrators of human rights abuses, and thirdly, come up with some structure of reparations for those who were determined to be victims of human rights abuses due to apartheid. And so the commission was actually split up into 3 committees: the Human Rights Committee, the Amnesty Committee, and the Reparations Committee. In order to qualify for amnesty, what an applicant had to show was, one, that the act for which they were applying for amnesty was politically motivated. So it was either motivated to be in support of maintaining apartheid or be part of the liberations movement actions to end apartheid. So it had to be politically motivated. In order to qualify for amnesty, there had to be some kind of balance, if you like, balance between the action and the aims of the action. So and how you decide what balance looks like in terms of human rights abuses, I'm not sure. So fortunately, I wasn't asked to do that. And then, in order to qualify, the applicant had to tell the truth. So they had to tell the whole truth about the act in which they had participated. And if you saw Long Night's Journey into Day, most of that film is about amnesty applications. And it is amnesty applications both from government, those who were working to support apartheid, and also from those of the opposition and liberation movements. The other important thing about the Amnesty Committee is that it was the one specialized committee of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in that in order to be on the Amnesty Committee, you had to be a lawyer, you had to be an advocate. So it was the one that was truly a legal process that was part of South Africa's legal process. And once somebody qualified for amnesty, it was a full amnesty. It wasn't just from criminal litigation, it was also from civil prosecution. So if the amnesty committee decided that you qualified for amnesty, then your victims and their families could not then come later and say, we want a civil suit. So amnesty was really a total amnesty. Once you were granted amnesty, you walked away and continued your life. And the other major committee was the Human Rights Committee, which was the largest committee of the TRC, in fact, and which heard the stories of victims and survivors of human rights abuses. So that's the TRC in a nutshell. What I would like to spend more time on is what was the learning, I think, for South Africa from this process. And so the first is, I think that for many of us walking into that process, the idea of amnesty and the way it was enshrined was problematic. I mean, as I said, that people walked away. Once you qualified for amnesty, that was it. Your slate was truly clean. And first of all, you didn't have to show remorse in any shape or form, which to me initially was very problematic. That how do we give amnesty to somebody who doesn't even recognize that there is something that they need to be remorseful about in their actions? I think subsequently I've rethought that a little bit because having been a parent and told your child to say I'm sorry to a sibling, and they say it, right? I'm sorry. But, if I'm sorry's could kill, we would have many dead bodies in our houses, because the ways in which sons and daughters say to brothers and sisters, I'm sorry, shows very, very far from remorse. And so thinking about it in the context of the TRC, I think that it was healthy to say, we're not going to require remorse, because what we then had was that those people who truly did feel remorse had to take the initiative to ask to meet with their victims, to show their remorse, to apologize. And that also allowed victims to be the ones to decide whether or not they wanted to hear this apology. And I think that's a really important thing that we often, particularly as Christians, I think we get twisted, that we rush to ask people, are you ready to forgive? And we celebrate people who forgive quickly. And I wonder, and we always will go back to Jesus said 70 times 7, right? But we forget that Jesus said, when your brother comes to apologize to you, you forgive, right? So the idea that we ask people to forgive in contexts that have nothing, that where there is no one who has asked for their forgiveness, to me is problematic, and maybe we'll get to talk about that a little bit later. The other thing that we learned was, which we should have known, really, I mean, we're human beings, we really should have known, that telling the truth is not as easy as all that. Because they're like, all you have to do is tell the truth and you get off. I mean, there doesn't even seem to be any kind of thing that you have to work out in your mind. If telling the truth sets you free, then tell the truth. And yet we saw over and over people coming to apply for amnesty and being unable or truth. And I mean, we had examples of police who were asked about the deaths in police jails of political prisoners, and would come and apply for amnesty. And one of the examples was, they said, yes, we killed that young man, we arrested him, we held him in jail for a few days, then we gave him a drugged coffee to drink, and when he fell asleep, we shot him. And I mean, that's not, I know that doesn't sound that great, right? That sounds pretty awful in and of itself. However, when the body was exhumed, it was clearly not somebody who had died in a drugged sleep. It was clearly the body of somebody who had been tortured over a long period of time and had died an excruciating death. So then you start to ask, well, if telling the truth is about, is the guarantee of freedom, and lying is the possibility of going to jail, why would somebody lie? It doesn't seem to make sense. And, we came up with all kinds of reasons why people lie. And one was that the hearings were televised and on radio in South Africa, and so, I mean, they were heard across the country. They were televised on radio daily, and on Sundays there was an hour to 2 hour long program that was a TRC kind of wrap-up, a national wrap-up, telling us what had happened during the week at the TRC, because those hearings were going on throughout the day. So if you're at work, you're not going to be able to follow them. So we had this weekly TRC wrap-up, if you like. And so the idea for people that what they were saying and what they had done was now public knowledge. And what became very clear from many people who testified is that their families had no idea what their jobs actually were. That many of them, family members, neighbors, knew that they were police officers, but didn't know that they were part of death squads or part of the secret police. And so people were finding out for the first time that their husband, their uncle, their father was a torturer and a murderer. And so maybe that was the thing that, held people back from, how do I, for the first time, tell my family, my friends, what I have been doing, and it is on a national stage. But I think maybe even more importantly was that people had to claim that story for themselves. So for many of them, it wasn't simply telling the truth for the first time to their families, it was telling the truth the first time to themselves, right? And if you saw the film, you'll see the police officer who says, we were doing what we were told to do. We were following, we were protecting our country. We were told we were protecting our country from communists, from people who wanted to destroy our nation, and all of this we did with government sanction and government support. And I think the person who made that so very clear for us was somebody who didn't qualify for amnesty, and is now actually, there's a conversation going on in South Africa about granting him amnesty now that he has been in jail since the end of apartheid. Eugene de Kock, whose nickname was Prime Evil, and he was the head of Vlakplaas, which was a torture center, and also was the head of some of the death squads that acted both inside South Africa and in surrounding countries. Because when he testified, one of the things that he spoke about was living as two people. So that there was the Eugene DeCock, who was a father, a husband, a neighbor, a churchgoer, the guy who hung out with his friends and had barbecues and parties and loved his children. And then there was Eugene DeCock, the man who went into the home of a family in Archridgeville and slaughtered the whole family. The man who led a group of police and soldiers who ambushed some young men trying to leave the country to join the ANC and murdered them and burnt their bodies. So he spoke about basically living as two people, and that it wasn't just that he lied to his family and friends about who he was, but that he actually lied to himself. And the realization that the TRC brought was that you're really not two people. There's just one person, and it is the same person who rocks your child to sleep, is the same person who tortured somebody else's child. And so I think that for many, part of the difficulty of coming in front of the Amnesty Committee was, yes, telling the truth to friends and neighbors, but also telling a whole truth to yourself about who you are and what you have become and what you have been willing and able to do, and that there is only one of you doing your whole life, right? And as a lesson coming out of that lesson was, I think a really, really important lesson for us was how easy it is and how counterproductive it is to place evil in another, right? So when we heard the stories, our first reaction when we heard these stories are, what kind of people are these? What kind of monsters? What kind of, thank goodness I'm not them, right? And yet, I think that what the process taught us, particularly as we listen to stories about people talking about being in a crowd and being part of a crowd that necklace people. And the necklace was where they put a tire around someone's neck and filled it with gas and then set the tire and the person on fire. Right? And that people talking about being part of a group that was able to watch another human being burn and not consider themselves as evil, right? And what I think that what that taught, what that, at least to me, what that said to me is how important it is to recognize in ourselves the possibility of evil, right? That it is easy and comforting to look at the other and say evil, abusive, all the horrors, the darkness of the soul that we can see very easily in other people. But that the lesson of the TRC is how we as normal people can become the evil people, or at the very least be bystanders and allow evil to exist, right? And I think that was, that to me, with all the flaws of the TRC, that lesson in and of itself, to me, was a salvation of the TRC. That to make us as a country stop and recognize that the possibility for evil dwells in each of us. And at the same time as we were given that opportunity, we were also given the opportunity to recognize that the possibility for great humanity exists in each of us as well. Because when we saw those who came to the Human Rights Committee, who came to share their stories about being tortured, about having family members disappear, about being held in prison without trial, about the experiences of solitary confinement, about the experiences even of house arrest and banning. Because people would often think, well, if somebody is under house arrest, then it's not so bad because, at least you're in your own home. And yet when people spoke about the experience, that there's something particularly torturous about being your own jailer. That, if you break the orders of your house arrest, it's not just you who will suffer, it is the family member or the neighbor who was part of the breaking of that order. And the order could be broken by something as simple as two people being in the room with you at the same time. So while we said, thinking that house arrest is something it's not so bad. When you listen to people's stories, to recognize how horrific that actually is. But that when we heard the stories of those people, when they shared with us their experiences and what it was that they learned from that, and what that brought up in them, the amazing thing is the number of people who, for them, the experience of torture, the experience of prison, the experience of banning was one that made it so much clearer to them their shared humanity, their connection with the rest of humanity, and the importance of recognizing one another's humanity. One of the people who actually didn't feature much in the TRC, but was somebody who I had grown up knowing, Bishop Malusi Mlwana, and he, this is the thing about living in situations of oppression. You come up with some pretty sick jokes, right? And so one of our sick jokes about Malusi was that he was in and out of prison so much as a political activist that the joke was, if the head of the prison walked around the prison and found there was an empty cell, we'd be like, what? We've got an empty cell? Somebody go and find Malusi. We can't have this empty cell just sitting here. Because it seemed like every time he walked out of jail, he was being taken back in. And he talks about an experience of being tortured. And he said, in that moment, the most powerful thing that came into my mind was that these people torturing me had lost their humanity. And that part of our struggle had to be to help them to reclaim their humanity. So we heard, as I said earlier, we heard the extent of evil and the fact that that evil could reside in each and any of us. But we also saw people who were regular people who, if you describe them now to themselves, if you said to them that I think you're a hero, you're an amazing person, you're whatever, they would look at you like, really, what are you talking about? Because it was for them an experience of shared and indivisible humanity. If you saw the film, one of the most powerful places for me is with the story of the Guguletu 7. the young men who were killed in a police ambush in a township outside Cape Town. And the backstory to that is that for some of those mothers who appeared at the TRC, the first time that they realized that their child was dead was turning on the evening news and seeing, one of them described, seeing her son lying on the road, his leg tied by a rope to a police van, and the police van driving down the road, dragging his body, right? So that was her first realization that her son has been killed. And then the struggle that they had in trying to find out the truth of what happened to their children. They got an amnesty hearing, and then one of the police officers who had applied for amnesty actually said he wanted to meet with the mothers. He wanted to apologize to the families of the young boys, that he wanted to express his remorse. And one of the mothers walks into that meeting saying, I don't care what that man says to me. There is nothing he can say to me that will make me see him as anything less or more than an evil murderer. I'm walking into this meeting because the people at the TRC said he asked for it and we're going to do it as a group. But I'm telling you, there is absolutely nothing that this man can say to me that will convince me that he deserves to be forgiven. And they went into the meeting and they really did interrogate him. I mean, what were you thinking? What was going on in your mind as you were selling out our children, as you are, on the one hand, encouraging them to participate in the uprising, and on the other hand, telling the police that you have identified a group of terrorists, and then being part of their murder. And I mean, the conversation went on for a very long time. And eventually, the very woman who had walked in there saying, there is nothing he can say or do that will make me even see a human being when I deal with him, says to him, your name means prayer, right? And he says, yeah, that's what my name means prayer. And then she says, my son, I have a prayer for you. So that, I mean, for me, just that she said to the person who killed her son, my son, recognizing a young man who made awful choices and was caught in the same system that caught her and murdered her son, right? And for me, it is that speaks to who we can be if we choose to be. To be people not who negate evil that we see, but who recognize the humanity even of those who attempt to dehumanize us. And so that for me is the lesson of hope from the TRC. Both sides of it, that if we can recognize the extent of darkness, the potential of darkness that lives in each of us, and also recognize the extent and potential of light that resides in each of us, then we move in the world in a very different way. We are not so much in a hurry to find scapegoats for what goes wrong in our communities, and more about what is it that we as a community can do to change how we interact with one another, how our community is structured, what are the opportunities that we can offer each other to be healthy communities of healthy people. And the last lesson, because I know that I'm going on, right? What are we time on?
I got like another hour.
Okay. Oh, okay. Don't tell me that. But that, the other thing that for me was that came out of the TRC. So I'm going to say the last two things, and we can start with questions. And if you don't have questions, then I'll carry on with stories. But the two things that came out of it for me, and particularly as a South African who has lived in South Africa and the U.S. and sees the similarities and differences in these societies. So the one was a lesson that President Mandela made to us as a country, right? And so you know how we were as South Africans after President Mandela was released, and the stories about him off, the Rugby World Cup thing, supporting our rugby team, inviting his prison guards to all his celebrations, and reaching out and accepting the Peace Prize with de Klerk. We acted like Mandela was all of us, right? It was like, people say, where are you from? South Africa. Nelson Mandela? Yeah, that's us. Yeah, we are the saintly nation. And President Mandela was saying that, it is wonderful to be that person that my country people lift up as an example and a model of South Africa. But if we want to be true South Africans, we have to also claim ourselves as the country that had a Eugene Decaux. So we didn't just produce a Nelson Mandela, we also produced somebody whose nickname is Primeval. And we can't claim Mandela if we don't claim Decaux. And that lesson for me is really important in South Africa, but I think it's really, really important in the US as I have lived here longer. And I'll tell you why I think that. Because what that statement said is the second part of the learning for me. Is what that statement said was that as a nation, we can't choose which history we're going to highlight. That if we want to teach about ourselves, we have to teach about ourselves. And I say that as someone who taught at the University of Hartford, and I taught a class that was about the Black experience around the world. And those of you who are teachers will know this, particularly in tertiary institutions, is that what we like to do is at the beginning of the semester, right, we ask students, why are you in this class, the first day of class? Because we haven't got the syllabus ready yet. Why do that? But, why are you in this class? And I was struck by how often students said they wanted to learn about slavery. And so I'm thinking, you've been in school for 12 years, and only now that you're in college, you're wanting to learn about slavery. What were you doing during history classes or social science classes? And then I had children in school in this country. And if we were fortunate, they got a chapter on slavery. If we were fortunate. Most often it was a paragraph in the social studies book about, this terrible thing happened, for a paragraph of our history. And all the other wonderful things that happened that then can fill up the other 400 pages of the history books. And for me, it is, again, about what is it that we are teaching? Why do we teach history? And what I have come to think about the U.S. is that we teach history to teach pride, rather than teaching history to learn from the lessons of history. So we have young people in 12th grade who have never heard of the Trail of Tears, who have never heard of Japanese internment, who have heard a paragraph about slavery, and it's not saying slavery was a horrific, it's about, this happened in the South, but then we signed the Emancipation Proclamation and everything was fine, right? And so for me, one of the biggest gifts I think that the TRC offers the world is that what it's made us as South Africans do is pay attention to our whole story. That what happened in South Africa in order to support a particular political system, and what role we all played in that, whether it was a role of being those who were oppressed, those who were acting against the system, those who kind of just went along to go along, and those who actively supported the system. So that to me is, again, priceless. Something that I think that we offer the world as a way of living our truth. So I'd like to offer a space for questions, commentaries.
I think if people have questions, probably the best way to do this is we're spread out. If you have a question, kind of come around here. We're going to put this microphone here off to the side, and you can use it to ask questions. If you have a question, come on up.
Okay, you're fine.
Okay, this.
Oh, oops.
Yes, I don't want. That's where I don't want to. So fine. Can you move that? I don't want to crush your equipment. Go ahead.
Naomi, I just want to say thank you for just coming to talk with us today. And after your speech, I'm just so filled. What you just said is something that I've been thinking and reckoning with, getting to the truth of all of what's happening. And I've always shared that with my family, that we're not being honest and open and true, being true to our history or to ourselves. And you help me see that I'm not on the wrong path. And that if we can just be open and honest about, it's not that blacks want to be free and just do whatever. They want the truth to be told. And yes, we're Americans, and yes, this did happen to us. And we want the blacks, the whites, everybody to recognize that we're all Americans here now in America, because this thing we did in the past was not right and it did happen. It's part of our history. It's part of the American history. And once we convince all our children and tell them this story and see what we can do, like just the humanity of it, what we've done to each other, how much hurt we can put on each other, as well as love that we can share with each other. We can walk freely together and not saying, well, why are you here? You need to go back there. We know nothing about Africa. We have never lived Africa. We belong together here, so we can walk like Africans in America. So I really thank you for letting that come to the surface, even for me to be convinced that I'm on the right track with my thoughts. Thank you.
This past week, I've been doing a lot of thinking, and for the first time, it took me 51 years to understand what white supremacy actually is. It's not a belief. It's a policy that then gives birth to rules, regulations to ensure it. And in thinking about that, and the mass incarceration of African Americans in this nation, I then had to come to grips with the fact that slavery has been legal in this nation for 150 years in every state. because the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, has an exception. It is legal to enslave those who have been convicted of a crime. And in that is the poison fruit of tree, the fruit of which is corruption in our criminal justice system. We now have corporations that own prisons and stockholders who own stock in most companies. And their prime mission is to generate profit for their shareholders, which means in order to generate profit, you have to have a product. And those products are slaves. So there's corruption in supplying that product. That product is then sold to corporations who pay pennies a day for their labor. How does one start the process of educating people, a nation, starting a movement to first have us recognize that we didn't abolish slavery, we codified it in a way that was made acceptable to everyone, because it only involves prisoners, people who have committed a crime, but it doesn't always. They haven't always. How do we get people to realize that in the 21st century, that exception has no place in our Constitution? How do you begin with that? Where do you begin with something like that?
Is that a question for me? I think that's with every human rights issue, that we have to allow people to enter in at different places, right? So I have a former classmate at Vanderbilt who said, since I finished high school, my calling has been to dismantle the cradle to prison pipeline. And I've been searching as to what it is that, where do I enter into this process? And I thought it was going to be through ordination or something, so I did my MDiv. But I have realized that for me, it comes from being in the education system and raising questions about how our education system is run. So when we're talking about the slavery that is the prison, we need people who are talking about the fact that we are expelling and suspending kindergartners, right? So what is it that a kindergartner can do that would lead them to be expelled from school? And whose kindergartner is likely to be expelled, right? And so even before we get to the prison, we need to be looking at what's happening in our schools, right?
But the prison and this exception creates the policy that leads to kindergartner being expelled.
And I agree with you, but what I'm saying is that to dismantle a system like that, we need people at every stage of that to find the place that strikes them as particularly what they can fight. And so I think it's important, one, that how many people even know that clause of the amendment, right? How are we educating our children to pay attention to,
I had never.
I know,
It was hiding in plain sight
sight.
all this time.
but also who is paying attention to the police officers? Who is paying attention to the parole officers? Who's paying attention to the public defenders, the lawyers, the people who are making profit? So there are so many places along the way where we can each enter. And I think it's important to allow people to find the place where they enter into the system of injustice to change it to a system of justice. And so I'm not sure what we say to anybody that they need to be doing. I know that when I was telling some friends that, you know, I started reading Michelle Alexander's book while I was traveling around, which I do a lot, and I have enough miles now on Delta that I usually get upgraded. And so I'd be sitting in first class reading this book, and I'm the only black person very often in first class. And I'm looking around and I'm seeing white businessmen, and I'm like, I better put this book down because I'm getting really angry. Because I don't know who you are. You might be CCA sitting right here next to me. And I need to work. And so, and I tell that story to say that it is easy to get ourselves in the emotion of it and not look at where do I enter? Where do I enter in this place? And what is it that what is the role that I can play? So, I mean,
So the answer is along the entire
you
continuum.
enter along the entire continuum, and we offer people a place to enter. Thank you. Thank you.
That helps a lot.
Thank you very much.
For me, I weep over my racist history at the beginning, and most whites don't want to know our history. We don't even bother to forgive. We just forget it. And if we just go back and look at the facts, out of 10.7 million people that came to the Americas, all of this part of the world, only 388 ended up in the United States, and another maybe 70,000 came from the Caribbean. So we're only talking about 458,000, or just 1 out of every 25. And out of that 488,000, at the time the Civil War started, there were 4 million enslaved people. And the whites don't even ask that question. It's obvious what happened. In fact, by 1808, it was outlawed in the international slave trade. White slave owners had enough slaves that they could do what they now needed to do and were doing. And that was the breeding. Over 2.5 million people were bred by whites. And it wasn't just that number, but it was what they bred into them. They bred them like a horse, you know, to have speed, endurance, and strength, and also to have as low an IQ as they could do unskilled labor, to have a personality that was very docile and compliant. And so, you know, even though the Civil War ended, the South really didn't think they were going to lose that war, let's be honest. And so they created the narrative, and even though they lost the war, their narrative is our narrative of that war. It wasn't Gone with the Wind. It had nothing to do with Gone with the Wind. And, you know, the 20 Negro Law wouldn't have existed, which was to simply say, wealthy whites, if you have 20 or more slaves, you didn't have to serve in the Confederacy. And created a draft in one law, and the second law created that they didn't have to serve, and they didn't. Poor whites had to serve and be killed. And in that process, the very wealthiest and the most famous people in our textbooks, I mean, most of them in the early years are those slave owners that raped and bred. And it didn't start breeding at adulthood. You bred children. Once you had your first period, and a slave person, that female was to then breed more slaves. So for me, I weep over our failure to face our own truth. We're not facing our truth. And so when slavery ended, physically it ended, but no other way did it end. And we can see tremendous profit, not only financially, in every area for whites. All whites are racist in that sense because we are born into this state of privilege and we won't acknowledge it. So what do you see that the impact of our failure to this day to teach the real history in our history books, to teach the real history so that we can finally accept what we did, how horrendous it is, and change it? Because we won't change it until we know it exists. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, people are asking me questions that I better get a Nobel Peace Prize. If I find the answers to these. I mean, I think that it goes back to what you've said and what I said, that we really have to start teaching the true history. And I, for me, it has, this last 8 years has been really interesting in the U.S. because, that people talked about the election of President Obama as making clear that we now we're in a post-racial America. When what I think it actually did was it brought up all of those racist things that had been underlying, that the fear of the black man, right? And we only have to look at the ways in which President Obama has been portrayed in media and his family, but also the discussions that not even just the discussions, but even the actions that have come. I still cannot get out of my head the picture of was the governor of Arizona shaking her finger at President Obama and then saying that she was scared. I was like, oh my Lord. I mean, I have never, ever seen anyone shake a finger at a president. Never. And then to be able to turn around and say, he scared me? I mean, if that isn't white privilege, I seriously don't know what that looks like there. But that, but those are, I think that, that picture is those are the pictures that highlight an underlying thing that has never, as you say, has never been dealt with. And I think that there has been, I honestly believe that underlying the continuation of racism in this country is actually a sense of guilt. And the guilt that if we ever actually say what it is, what has happened, that these people are going to turn on us and do to us what we did to them. So if we can keep quiet about it, pretend that it really doesn't exist, and keep papering over, we will get over. That it'll end. And I say that because that was part of the response that came from many white South Africans when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission first started was, what you're trying to do is dig up wounds. And if you would just cover it over, we would all be fine. And anybody knows that you can't just paper over a wound, that all that happens is that it gets poisonous. That we can only heal a wound when we clean a wound. And when we admit that there is a wound, people, and I think, and I really do think that it is a non-trusting in the humanity of everybody else. I seriously do.
Thank you.
I know that we all have hearts full of words, and this is bringing all those words out, but I'm going to ask if we can kind of keep our questions sort of short, because there's a bunch of people in a limited amount of time, so we can maximize the time that we have. So thanks. Come on, Sam.
First of all, I want to say the 8 card has not fallen far from the tree. Second of all, I will admit I'm a historian, okay? And you are correct. When people come into my class the first day, why are you in this class? It's because I don't have the syllabus ready. But the one thing I do tell them is forget everything you have been taught in history. I'm going to tell you the truth. And the one thing we need to do is spend time on slavery, because slavery was a great part of America. People don't remember that not everybody was emancipated after the Civil War. Missouri was like 12 years afterwards. We still had slaves here. So that's very important that history comes out. My question to you is because of the TRC. You have both people on both sides of the field. Those who have been hurt, those who have done the hurting. And you have naysayers, I'm sure, on both sides of those fields. How do you answer when they say this is not going to work? What is your, how do you make them believe this is really going to work? That's my question.
Yeah, and I mean, I have to fess up that I was on the naysaying side myself, right? So, because I really did think, for me, the big thing was this amnesty that then people walked away, and I wasn't one who said we needed to send people to jail, but I did think that we needed to have people do some personal restitution, right? That as an individual, yes, it was the system that set you up to do that, but as an individual, you acted in this way. And so I think that there needs to be, as an individual, some responsibility and some giving back to the nation in admitting that I took something from the nation. But again, nobody asked me, so let's move on. But I think that the process itself was what largely brought the naysayers back to the table. That, white naysayers on the white side were saying that this was just going to be a witch hunt of white South Africans, and that it was just, digging up old wounds, and really was just completely unfair. And naysayers on the black side of the community said this was just going to be a complete whitewash. And I use whitewash advisedly. And that it was simply a way to cover the shame of apartheid. And we had neither, we got something close to the middle of those. That it was, I think that the process itself is what won people over. Even as people have stated how flawed the process was, but that the fact that it was the first time in the world that we had tried a process that insisted on the truth as part of the process of any kind of amnesty or healing. And having the commission be one that traveled around the country, therefore giving people the access to hear and to tell their stories, was what I think. I mean, there are still people who say, it didn't achieve, and it didn't achieve everything that it was hoped to achieve. And I would love to see the human endeavor that ever does. But that it went a long way to beginning a process of reconciliation in South Africa. And there's nothing more that you can give naysayers than for them to see a process that is trying to work.
Hi, I have a South Africa question as well. I was in your country in 2009, rented a car with my son, and we drove around through many parts of South Africa, and for reasons that are perhaps weirdly particular to me. I'm interested in Afrikaans language culture, and I visited many of the holy sites of Afrikaans culture in Pretoria and Bloemfontein and Paarl, the alleged birthplace of the Afrikaans language, and Stellenbosch, and ultimately Cape Town. So I'm wondering, what is the status of cultural reconciliation with respect to some of these language, English language speaking groups and the remaining African language speaking peoples?
We have 11 official languages in South Africa, and Afrikaans is one of those official languages. And so it is still a recognized language in South Africa with a large percentage of South Africans who count Afrikaans as their first language. I don't think, when you say the remaining Afrikaners, I don't think that we have to worry about Afrikaans disappearing as a first language for South Africans for any foreseeable future. The whole history thing that for me is really interesting is that if you look at the real roots of Afrikaner, the language, it is the colored people of South Africa who were the children of the slaves and slave owners who mixed up their parents' languages, right, to make this language. So I don't see Afrikaans disappearing in any shape or form in any foreseeable future. I think that what we do still have is that there is a proportion of Afrikaans-speaking people who are not looking at Afrikaans culture, but are looking at it as being a white privileged, white supremacist. So when you have people in, what is it called, Orange, did you go there to their, to their little enclave that is supposed to be a pure Afrikaner homeland? Those are the things that concern people in South Africa, that the Afrikaans language and culture is being hijacked as being representative of white supremacy rather than being a South African language and culture.
Thank you very much for coming and traveling and for enduring a flight this distance. In a self-righteous way, I can sit here and tell you that I grew up in an enlightened household with parents that taught me well, an education system. But when I walk out my front door, you cannot tell what my ethnicity, background is, what religion, what my sexual preference is, and depending on how I choose to dress today, I can, whether I'm working class, or owning class, you can't tell me of that. And what's happened, I've come to realize, I've been a passive beneficiary as a white male. I've been a passive beneficiary of a system that is distinctly biased. And today, I'm not living in spiritual peace, knowing how that evolved. And my quest and why I come to hear people like you speak is what can I do today to change things here, for one, in this country. And it's not simply over a guilt, but to put a system in place that this sort of racist environment that we live in today is not going to perpetuate. And that's what my question is, what can I do here to counter that? And when we see apartheid and racism rear its ugly head, and the risk of stirring up controversy in Palestine is one such example. So anything you can advise on that, what direction people like me can go that look like me and you know, been the beneficiary of a racist system over the years, whether we like knew it or not. Love to hear it.
So I mean, I think that the first is that recognition, right? That if once you recognize your privilege, then that in and of itself is a step, because there are many who say there is no such thing. But that again, I'm almost back to that first question about where do you enter into questioning the system? Where are the opportunities that exist for you to highlight the ways in which white privilege works? And, you know, and some of them I think can be really small, seem to be small things, but that make an important statement. And so a couple of years ago, I was speaking to a church women's group, and I was asked that same question by the church women. You know, as white women, what can we do to change the system? And I said, you know, for me, there are many dramatic things you can do, but there are some that might seem really small to you. So for me, one thing that I would love to have happen just once in my life, just one day in my life, is that if I'm walking in a department store and security starts following me, and I ask security, why are you following me? What is it about me that would make you follow me? Just once to have a white person in the vicinity say, yes, why are you following her? It's such a small thing. But my normal experience is that then people look away and try and, you know, like, oh my gosh, sipping my tea over here. But that, so sometimes it's something as small as that. And other times it is when we have situations of violence against people of color, that to have true white allies say, hey, you know, yes, maybe that girl did not turn over her cell phone to the teacher. And maybe she should have stood up when they told her to stand up. But in what universe is it okay for somebody who is meant to be guarding the safety of these children to throw a child across the room? That, you know, there is no justification. And to say that she was rude, she is a teenager. Show me a teenager who has never been rude. And maybe I'll show you Jesus Christ, but even then, Mary might have something else to tell us about that, right? So that because the conversation so often around black children, women, men who are killed, who are beaten, is what they did. We need people who come from the place of white privilege to say that can't be who we are.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. You know, when I think about our race and different nationalities, I think about the Nubian community, where there were empires. And there were empires for years, for decades. And things were running well. You know, everybody had their own tribal territory. You know, we're the ones that are having crops. We're going to do corn over here. We're going to make We can use the wood from the land, from the trees to make paper. When I think about racism, if that's the word, I think about creation. Now, God created everybody in His image and likeness, which means we have the power of light in us, and we have the power of anger in us, and we have the power of creativity. And my question is, okay, how did the Nubians come in charge for decades? And how did humanity begin in the Garden of Eden, which is in Africa? So everything starts in Africa. And I've heard whites say, yeah, we came from Africa. So if the black men and black women started the entire population, then we're actually all connected. We bleed. We all have to eat, and God is faithful. And He's love. And His whole purpose for us to love. That's it. Now, I don't know who dropped the ball in Africa. I have no idea. But there was something on 60 Minutes, and a king's niece came before 60 Minutes and apologized for her uncle who started slavery in Africa. And I said, was it for money? Was it for alcohol? Now, we all have something to give. But since being in a 12-step program, I just learned all this stuff in 2010 because I wasn't really interested in racism. I was interested in what I could give to humanity, how I could get off of drugs and alcohol. But since 2010, I looked at the race, and I looked at humanity. And in 2007, I looked on the internet, and there was a black couple giving birth to a white baby. It was recently aired that told me that the whites came from the black race. And that's why we're colorful. Black, a lot of colors come from the color black. So looking at that, I'm like, okay, maybe these other nationalities are angry with the black race because somebody dropped the ball or whatever. Yes, everything I believe began in Africa, but we have two spirits inside of us. We've got darkness and we have light. Okay, and it depends on what we choose to do with whatever spirit is leading us. You said something earlier. If we don't look at ourselves, we're lost. If we don't do inventory on ourselves, because you've got blacks against blacks, okay? You've got whites against whites. And you've got, one thing about the white race I must say, you all may not like each other, but you work together with me. No? I can look at the Chinese, they have their own differences and so forth, but they have industries. They come together. So, my question is, okay. Right. What do we do about ourselves? How do we process what's in ourselves? That's all.
Well, I think it probably goes back to my sermon, right? Is about what do we do about ourselves? Is that we look at those places both of darkness and light, and offer both up as needing God's intervention to help us be the light in the world and not participate in spreading darkness for ourselves or for others. And I think you're right that we really do have to do the self-inventory as individuals, as families, as churches, as communities, as countries, as a world. We have to do that, looking at what are those places of our self, our individual self, of our family, of our community, of our country, that are places of light, and which are the places of darkness. And unless we can look at both and claim both, there is no way to allow the light to be the place that shines.
We have time for 2 more questions if you make them quick.
All right. I usually find that very difficult to do, but I just wanted to come up and look at you closer. I want to close it up. I want to get a picture later. Okay? My name is Mike Evans. I teach American history, and you're right on target when you talk about, the history and knowing our history. But I won't go into that, and I'm not going to ask you a political question either.
Next, man.
I'd like to ask maybe 2 questions. One is, when did Naomi Tutu stop being Bishop Tutu's daughter? When did you get your own name? When did you recognize who you were and not what people saw as you just being, oh yes, that's Bishop Tutu's daughter? When did that happen? That's question number 1. Question number 2 is, can you talk just briefly about your ancestors, Shaka Zulu, or the Zulu tribe? Can you just give us a little, you're Zulu? You're not Zulu? Oh, how did that happen? Anyway, could you talk about that just briefly? Thank you.
So the first part, there's, for many people, I am still Naomi Tutu, the daughter of Desmond Tutu, and I'm one of them, the daughter of Desmond and Nomalizo Tutu, and I think I will always be. But I understand your question about finding my own voice and who did I want to be in the world, and I have to say that I think that I've always had that the awareness, and it came largely because of my mother. So, when I was growing up, Desmond Tutu was not Desmond Tutu, world figure, but he was Desmond Tutu, a priest in the Anglican Church. And anybody who is a priest's kid can tell you that there are particular trials and tribulations that come with being the offspring of a clergy. And but from our earliest time, my mother was really quick to respond to people who questioned something we said or did based on, oh my gosh, and you're a priest's child. And my mother would say, yeah, you said it, priest's child. Only one person in this house decided to go to seminary. And he decided. He wanted to go to seminary. He didn't take us with him. We were not sitting in the classes. We were not examined by the bishop. And if you have issues with the kind of priest that Desmond is, that's one thing. You have exactly that right. But to question my children based on the fact that their father is a priest, I'm not going to let you do that. And so we always knew that we had And so, with all the many meanderings that my life has taken, that fundamental understanding that my parents first and foremost saw me as an individual in my own right, with my own gifts, my own challenges, and my own issues, that gave me the freedom to be my own person in the world as well. And in terms of my answer, Shaka, I'm not Zulu. So, in South Africa we have many ethnic groups, and my ethnicity is Xhosa, which is the Click language, and then my father's mother's side is Tswana. So none of us are Zulu. Our ancestors are more in line with the Mandela, the Xhosa ethnicity. So we actually fought Shaka Zulu, and some of our ancestors actually ran away from Shaka Zulu. That's our claim to fame. Yeah, we escaped Shaka Zulu. Yeah.
I'm Michelle Woods. I'm an artist, photographer, and
Put the mic down.
you guys were.
You're like me,
Yeah, I'm
challenged.
Yeah. We were talking about, a couple of brothers got up here and we were talking about history. And we were talking about, you know, white folks dealing with their history and telling the truth and things like this and like that. But, you know, I often think about the history that goes beyond slavery, who we were before we were slaves or we were made to be slaves. And do we work harder if like people wanted to do something, you could persist on more of that history, not just, you know, we don't want to remember ourselves as, you know, any kind of slaves. You know, we want to remember ourselves before Africa was ever colonized in any way. So I think and being I'm into imagery, the images has to change. All of us are artists, and you know, sometimes things have been painted over a shade too light, and that changes everything. So I think us as everyday people need to reach back and get that history for us, because Marcus Garvey said, a person without their culture is like a tree without a root. So if we can just get what made us great again, which is that history in our history books, in your history books, so you can know the greatness that we come from, then I think we can change a lot of things. So.
Thank you.
I don't know, not a question, but you know.
I want to give you a chance just to sort of wrap up and leave us with whatever you would want to leave us.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for being here and listening a responsive and supportive audience. Thank you. And really to say that I do hope that the story of the TRC is one that gives hope. That it gives hope that there is always a chance to learn from our mistakes and to try and do something differently, something better, if we are willing to claim our mistakes. So, thank you.